When
Look at your
two
fancy
teenagers
uniform now,
mocked an
soaked
elderly
just like
man
you.
in a quiet coffee shop, they thought they were teasing someone harmless. What they didn't understand was that the man standing before them was a retired Navy
Focus
admiral,
fire on that
someone who
position.
once carried
I need a
responsibility
trajectory
far heavier
analyzed in the
than they
next
could
30
imagine.
seconds.
And they
Get to
never
work.
expected that a calm stranger nearby would recognize who he truly was and step in before disrespect
So I
turned
told
into
him,
something
you can't just put
unforgivable.
pineapple on everything.
Before
You
this
did not
story
say that. That is
unfolds,
too
take a
funny.
moment with
I
us.
totally did. He was
If
so
you believe
confused.
respect still matters, please share the story, leave a comment, and subscribe. So stories of honor, faith, and quiet strength continue to reach those who need them. Autumn settled over Harrison Falls, Ohio, slow and quiet, painting the streets in amber and gold, while the air carried a chill that lingered longer than it should have. The coffee shop on Main Street was already warm when Thomas Caldwell pushed the door open. At 77, Thomas no longer moved with speed, but he moved with purpose. He was tall, still noticeably so, his posture straight, despite the years that weighed on his joints. His shoulders were broad beneath a heavy navy blue coat, buttoned all the way up the fabric, darkened in places where age and use had thinned it. The coat was too warm for indoors. It always was. Yet Thomas never removed it. His hair was a uniform silver, neatly combed back, with the precision of a man who had once started every day the same way, regardless of weather or mood. His face was weathered, marked by deep lines carved not by comfort, but by responsibility. His jaw was firm, clean-shaven, with sharp angles that hinted at the man he had once been, decisive, commanding, unyielding. His eyes were pale blue, steady and observant, but distant, as though part of him remained elsewhere. He paused just inside the doorway, as he always did, letting his eyes adjust to the light, the movement, the sound. It was a habit formed long ago. Scan first, sit later. The bell above the door jingled softly behind him. Mary Sullivan, the barista, looked up from behind the counter. Mary was in her early 30s, slender with warm brown eyes and freckles scattered lightly across her cheeks. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose bun that never stayed neat for long. She had a gentle presence, the kind that put people at ease without effort. She noticed Thomas immediately, just as she did every morning he came in. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her smile easy and familiar. Same as always, Thomas inclined his head slightly. It was his version of a greeting. Words were rarely necessary. He crossed the room and sat at the small table by the window. It was his table, though no sign marked it as such. The chair creaked faintly as he lowered himself down, his movements careful, controlled. He placed both hands briefly on the tabletop, steadying himself before settling back. A faint tightening crossed his face, pain acknowledged, then dismissed. Outside, leaves skittered across the sidewalk in small spirals, carried by a restless breeze. Mary returned with his coffee, setting the mug down gently. Steam rose, carrying the familiar scent that Thomas associated with routine, with order, with something solid in a world that often felt unanchored. He wrapped his hands around the mug, but didn't lift it yet. Behind him, chairs scraped loudly. Two teenage boys occupied the table a few feet back. They were out of place in the quiet morning crowd, their voices sharp, their laughter careless. One of them, Brandon Hale, tall and thin, with sandy blonde hair that fell into his eyes, leaned back in his chair, feet stretched wide. His clothes were clean and expensive, in a casual way, the kind that came from never worrying about ruining them. Across from him sat Tyler Moore, shorter, heavier, through the shoulders, his dark hair cropped close. Tyler held his phone loosely in one hand, thumb flicking across the screen as though he might miss something important if he stopped looking. They noticed Thomas almost immediately. "Why's that old guy wearing a coat inside?" Brandon said loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Tyler snorted. "Maybe he thinks winter's coming early." Thomas heard them. He did not turn around. He had learned long ago that reacting often invited more attention. Silence, on the other hand, unsettled people. It denied them the satisfaction they sought. He took a slow breath in through his nose, then out again. The motion was subtle, barely visible beneath the heavy coat. Mary moved behind the counter, pretending not to hear. A few other customers shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping to their cups or phones. No one said anything. Brandon stood up, a clear plastic cup of water in his hand. Ice clinked softly as he moved. He walked past Thomas's table, his steps loose and careless, his shoulder brushing close. Then his wrist tilted. Cold water spilled, suddenly cascading down the front of Thomas's coat. The shock was immediate. The cold cut through fabric and memory, alike sharp and invasive. Water soaked into the wool, darkening it, running in thin streams toward the hem. Droplets fell to the wooden floor, each one sounding louder than it should have in the sudden silence. For a moment, no one moved. Brandon laughed. "Oops." Tyler's laughter followed, high and sharp, the sound of someone who had never been held accountable for anything that mattered. Thomas did not shout. He did not stand. He did not look at them. Instead, he looked down. His right hand moved first, swift and instinctive, pressing flat against his chest beneath the soaked coat. His fingers spread protectively over the left side, as though shielding something fragile. His left hand followed, gripping the fabric tightly, pulling it closed. The gesture was automatic, practiced. His breathing slowed, controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He had done this before, countless times, in places far colder and far more dangerous than this. The cold itself did not bother him. He had known cold that burned like fire, cold that stole breath and sensation and life. What unsettled him was the exposure. Standing had pulled the coat slightly open. The water had soaked deeper than he liked. For a brief moment, something that was meant to remain hidden had felt vulnerable. Mary rushed forward with napkins, her face pale. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He kept his gaze lowered, his hands firm against his chest, his posture slightly hunched inward, not in weakness, but in containment. Water dripped steadily from the hem of his coat, forming a small, spreading puddle on the floor. The shop remained quiet. No one laughed now. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint drip of water hitting wood. And Thomas Caldwell, 77 years old, sat perfectly still, head bowed, guarding his chest, as if the past itself had just been disturbed. Laughter broke the stillness first. Brandon's laugh was loud, careless, the kind that bounced off walls without shame. Tyler joined in a second later, his voice higher, nervous energy leaking through the sound. Someone near the counter shifted uncomfortably. A chair scraped faintly against the floor. Still, no one stepped in. "It was just an accident," Brandon said, lifting both hands in a mock surrender. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Relax, old man. It's just water." Water continued to drip from Thomas Caldwell's coat, each drop hitting the wooden floor with a soft, rhythmic sound. The coat clung darker now, heavy with moisture. Thomas remained seated, head bowed, both hands still pressed firmly against his chest, as if holding something in place. His breathing was slow, deliberate, controlled to the point of discipline. Mary stood frozen a few steps away, napkins clenched in her hands. Her face had gone pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Conflict made her uneasy. Always had. Years earlier, an argument between two customers had ended with a thrown chair and a police report. Since then, she had learned to wait to hope situations resolve themselves. Near the pickup counter, Ethan Rowe turned fully around. Ethan was 43, though most people guessed younger from the way he stood, balanced alert weight, evenly distributed, as if his body never fully relaxed. He had a compact muscular frame built from function rather than display. His dark hair was cut short, flecked with gray at the temples, and his beard was trimmed close, more habit than fashion. There were faint scars on his hands, thin white lines that came from old injuries rather than accidents. His eyes were what noticed first. Dark, steady, and sharp, they moved quickly but missed nothing. Years in uniform had trained him to read rooms the way others read signs. Who was loud? Who was quiet? Who was pretending to be calm? And who wasn't reacting the way a normal person would? Ethan's gaze locked on Thomas. He noted the hands pressed against the chest, the absence of panic, the way the old man hadn't raised his voice or even looked toward the boys. That posture curled inward protective was not humiliation. It was containment. Ethan stepped away from the counter. He moved without hurry, weaving between tables with an ease that suggested long familiarity with crowded spaces. People instinctively shifted to give him room. Not because he asked, but because something about his presence suggested it was wiser not to block his path. Tyler noticed him first. "Hey," Tyler said under his breath to Brandon, angling his phone slightly. "That guy's staring." Brandon glanced over, then shrugged. So Ethan stopped a few feet from Thomas's table, close enough to be heard, close enough to be involved. "That's enough," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was low even, and carried a weight that didn't come from volume. Brandon turned toward him, surprised. Up close, the difference between them was obvious. Brandon was taller, but narrow, all sharp elbows and restless movement. Ethan stood solid, grounded, his shoulders relaxed but ready. "We're not talking to you," Brandon said. "Mind your business." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the wet floor, then at Thomas's coat, then finally met Brandon's eyes. "It became my business when you crossed that line," Ethan said. "You've made your point. Walk away." Tyler laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the moment with humor. "Dude, chill. He's fine." Thomas slowly lifted his head. For the first time since the water had spilled, his eyes rose from the floor. They met Ethan's not with gratitude or relief, but with assessment. Thomas studied him the way one officer studies another, taking in posture, tone, presence. Their eyes held for a brief moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Thomas's eyes were not afraid. They were controlled, guarded, and deeply tired. They carried a familiarity with chaos that had long since settled into restraint. Ethan felt it instantly, the same way you recognized a fellow soldier in a crowd without knowing why. Brandon scoffed. "What, you his bodyguard now?" Ethan didn't look away from Thomas. "Sir," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Thomas hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "Yes," he said at last. His voice was calm, measured. "I am." But his hands did not move from his chest. Ethan noticed. Mary finally found her voice. I can get a towel," she said quickly. Or we can clean this up." Brandon waved her off. He said he's fine. Tyler lifted his phone again, angling it toward Thomas's face. "Man, you're taking this like a champ." "Respect." Ethan's head snapped toward the phone. "Put it away," he said. Tyler hesitated, then smirked. Or what the room seemed to shrink. Ethan took one step closer, not invading Tyler's space, just enough to make his presence unavoidable. His expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. Or you'll regret making this a bigger problem than it already is, Ethan said. It wasn't a threat. It was a prediction. Tyler's grin faltered. He lowered the phone slightly, but didn't put it away. Thomas shifted in his chair. The movement was small, but Ethan saw the tension ripple through his shoulders. The coat pulled tighter across his chest. "Please," Thomas said quietly, "let this be done." The request wasn't for himself. It was for everyone else. Ethan glanced at him again. Up close, he noticed the lines around Thomas's eyes, the way they deepened when he spoke. He noticed the scar peeking briefly at the collar before the coat shifted closed again. Old, deep, not decorative. Brandon rolled his eyes. "See? He's fine. You can go back to your coffee now, hero." Ethan didn't move. He remained where he was, silent, watchful, a barrier that hadn't been there before. The water had stopped dripping now. The puddle on the floor had spread into an uneven shape, reflecting the ceiling lights faintly. Thomas Caldwell sat still, hands pressed against his chest, eyes forward. And Ethan Rowe understood one thing with certainty. This wasn't over. The second spill was not an accident. Brandon didn't pretend this time. He lifted the plastic cup again, wrist-steady eyes fixed on Thomas Caldwell, as if daring him to react. Water poured out in a deliberate stream, splashing across the table edge and soaking deeper into the already wet coat. Ice clattered to the floor, scattering near Thomas's shoes. The sound snapped something loose. Thomas pushed his chair back and stood. For a brief moment, the movement was unsteady, not from fear, but from the sudden demand placed on a body that had learned to conserve itself. His legs straightened slowly. The coat shifted as he rose the heavy fabric, pulling open just enough for what lay beneath to be seen. Ethan saw it instantly. A scar ran diagonally across Thomas's left chest, long and uneven pale against weathered skin. It was not clean like a surgical line. It wasn't symmetrical. It had edges that told a story of tearing force of trauma that had not been planned or repaired neatly. The kind of scar you didn't get from age or from routine medical necessity. Ethan's breath caught. He had seen scars like that before on men who never talked about how they got them, on men who had been too close to explosions, too close to shrapnel, too close to decisions that came too late. Thomas reacted immediately. His hand shot up, pulling the coat closed with sharp urgency. The motion was faster than his earlier movements, fueled by instinct rather than caution. He turned slightly away, shoulders angling inward, reclaiming the barrier he had lost. "I said stop," he said quietly. His voice did not rise. It didn't shake. But it carried something new. The laughter faltered. Tyler hesitated. Phone still raised his expression, flickering with confusion. He had been filming for humiliation, not revelation. Whatever he had just captured didn't fit the joke anymore. Brandon scoffed, trying to regain control. "What, you hiding a tattoo or something?" Thomas didn't answer. He remained standing now, one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other holding his coat shut. His breathing was steady again, but the muscles in his jaw were tight cords standing out beneath thin skin. Mary rushed forward with a towel, this time her hands trembling. "Sir, please let me help you." She was close enough now to see Thomas properly, to see the way his eyes had gone distant, to see how his attention wasn't in the coffee shop at all. Ethan stepped closer, without thinking. He placed himself slightly to Thomas's side, not blocking him, not touching him, just present. Close enough that if Thomas swayed, he could catch him. Close enough that the boys would have to look at him to continue. Brandon noticed. His bravado wavered. "Man, you're making this weird," he said. "We were just messing around." Ethan's eyes never left Thomas's chest, now concealed again beneath soaked wool. "That wasn't messing around," Ethan said evenly. "That was intent." Tyler shifted his weight. He lowered his phone at last, slipping it halfway into his pocket. The energy around him had changed. He could feel it, even if he didn't understand why. Thomas swallowed. For a moment the past pressed in on him, metal screaming under strain heat, and cold colliding voices shouting orders he had given and would give again if time allowed him to rewrite anything. He felt the phantom ache beneath the scar. Not pain exactly, but memory. He had learned to live with it. He had not learned to have it seen. "Sit down," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." Thomas hesitated, then lowered himself back into the chair. This time, the movement cost him more. His shoulders sagged slightly as he sat as though standing had taken something from him he could not spare. Ethan remained standing. He glanced briefly at the scar's location, then at Thomas's face. The old man's expression was composed, but the control was deliberate, now maintained, rather than natural. Ethan knew that look. It was the look of someone who had learned to keep the worst parts of himself locked away because letting them surface helped no one. Brandon scoffed again, weaker this time. "You guys are acting like he's some kind of enough," Ethan said, sharper now. The word cut through the room. Brandon stopped. Silence settled again, heavier than before. Thomas adjusted his coat, carefully smoothing the wet fabric button by button, restoring order. His hands were steady, though his fingers lingered briefly over the left side before moving away. Ethan noticed that too. Whatever that scar represented, it wasn't just physical, it was guarded, protected, buried under layers of discipline and routine. The boys didn't laugh anymore. They didn't leave either. They stood there uncertain, caught between defiance and something like unease. Thomas finally looked up, not at them, but at Ethan. For a moment their eyes met again. This time there was recognition. Not familiarity, not friendship, but the quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding. Ethan knew then that Thomas Caldwell's past was not a simple one, and that the story behind that scar was not meant for casual ears. The coffee shop felt smaller than it had before, and something that had been hidden for decades had come dangerously close to the surface. Silence arrived the way storms did in open water, without noise at first, only pressure. Brandon and Tyler stepped closer, emboldened by the absence of consequences. Tyler raised his phone again this time, holding it inches from Thomas Caldwell's face. The screen glowed harshly, reflecting in Thomas's pale eyes. Brandon leaned in beside him, close enough that Thomas could smell cheap cologne and mint gum. "Say something," Brandon muttered. "People love a reaction." Thomas did not step back. He stood there, soaked coat clinging to his frame shoulders squared, despite the weight of water and memory. His hands were no longer pressed to his chest now. They rested at his sides, fingers relaxed but still. His breathing was even, measured, an old discipline returning when everything else fell away. "There are things," Thomas said quietly, "that shouldn't be stirred." His voice was low, almost conversational. Not a plea, not a threat, a warning. The words settled into the room and stayed there. Ethan felt a chill trace his spine. He had heard warnings like that before, spoken by men who knew exactly what would happen if lines were crossed, men who had already seen the cost. He stepped fully into position beside Thomas, not in front of him. The choice mattered. It said protection without replacement, presence without dominance. From this angle, Ethan could see the fine tremor in Thomas's jaw, not fear, but restraint. Holding back was costing him something. "Back up," Ethan said to Tyler, his voice calm and unyielding. "You're too close." Tyler hesitated. Up close, Ethan looked different than he had from across the room. His face was angular, jaw set beneath a short dark beard. His eyes were steady and unblinking, the kind that measured distance and outcomes. This was not a man who bluffed. Brandon scoffed, trying to recover bravado. "You his lawyer now." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, a quiet wall. Across the room, Caleb Morris, the coffee shop's manager, hovered near the counter. Caleb was in his late 40s, heavyset with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose when he was nervous. He wore a button-down shirt that had seen better days and kept wringing his hands together. Conflict terrified him. Years ago, he'd been shoved during a robbery at a different job, and ever since then, confrontation made his chest tighten and his thoughts scatter. He cleared his throat, then thought better of it. Customers sat frozen in their seats. A woman with a knitted scarf stared into her cup as if it might swallow her. A man in a work jacket shifted his weight, eyes darting toward the door. No one spoke. No one intervened. The silence grew heavier. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, his gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the coffee shop walls. The smell of wet wool and coffee faded, replaced by metal and salt and the low, constant groan of strain. He straightened his back a fraction more. "Please," he said, not to the boys, but to the room. "Let it rest." Tyler lowered the phone slightly. His confidence had begun to erode, replaced by unease. This wasn't fun anymore. The man wasn't breaking. He wasn't begging. He wasn't playing the role Tyler expected. Brandon sensed it too. He took a step back, then stopped himself, unwilling to appear weak. Ethan watched them carefully. He had seen this pivot before, the moment when people realized they were standing too close to something they didn't understand. The moment when silence became more unsettling than noise. Water dripped once more from Thomas's coat, hitting the floor with a soft tap. The sound echoed. Mary stood behind the counter, eyes wide, hands clasped tight against her apron. She wanted to say something, anything, but her voice wouldn't come. She could see now that this wasn't about spilled water. It was about something coiled and contained, something that had been dragged into the light without permission. Thomas shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. Even soaked and tired, his posture remained erect. There was no slouch, no collapse. It was the posture of a man accustomed to being watched, judged, followed. Ethan leaned in just enough for Thomas to hear him. "You don't have to explain anything," he said quietly. Thomas did not look at him. "I know." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of long experience. He had learned long ago that explanations rarely satisfied those who demanded them. Brandon broke the silence with a forced laugh. "This is getting weird." "Let's just sit down," Ethan said. 2 words. Flat. Final. Brandon froze. For a moment it seemed he might push back, might say something reckless. Then he looked around and saw the room watching, not judging, not condemning, waiting. He sat, Tyler followed, lowering himself into the chair more slowly, phone slipping fully into his pocket. Thomas remained standing. The silence did not lift. It pressed closer, thick and oppressive, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Thomas Caldwell stood there, water-soaked and composed. Eyes distant, posture unbroken. His refusal to react, to explain, to defend himself had changed the balance of the room, and everyone felt it. It happened faster than anyone expected. Brandon rose from his chair with a sudden, impatient motion, frustration flashing across his face. The silence had pressed on him too long, and he wanted control back. As Thomas Caldwell shifted his weight, Brandon shoved his shoulder hard, just enough to prove something not enough he thought to be called violence. Thomas stumbled. The moment cracked open like a fault line. Ethan moved without thinking. His body reacted before his mind caught up, one hand gripping Thomas's arm, the other bracing his back. He felt how light the old man suddenly seemed, how the soaked coat dragged him off balance. Ethan pulled him in close, steadying him, absorbing the impact himself. For an instant, the world narrowed. Thomas's breath hitched, not from pain alone, but from the jolt, physical and internal. His hand clutched Ethan's sleeve with surprising strength, fingers tightening as if grounding himself. Ethan leaned in instinctively, his shoulder forming a barrier between Thomas and the boys. "Easy," Ethan murmured low enough that only Thomas could hear. Thomas did not answer right away. His eyes had gone unfocused, fixed on nothing in the room. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath thin skin. The scent of wet wool coffee and something metallic rose in his senses, dragging memory with it. For a split second, Harrison Falls disappeared. Then Thomas spoke. His mouth was close to Ethan's ear, his voice barely more than breath. "I once gave the order to fire," he whispered, "and the man on the other end was one of mine." Ethan froze. Not figuratively, not emotionally, physically. The words landed with a weight Ethan had felt only a handful of times in his life, after-action reports read in silence, names spoken without ceremony, decisions that could never be undone. His grip tightened reflexively, not out of restraint, but shock. Thomas continued the words, steady, now stripped of drama. "He trusted my call." Ethan's throat went dry. This was not the language of regret told for sympathy. This was confession without absolution. A truth spoken only because it could no longer be held alone. Behind them, Brandon laughed nervously, trying to reclaim momentum. "Hey, watch it, old man. Don't fall apart on us now." The sound didn't reach Thomas. Or Ethan. Ethan's mind raced pieces, rearranging themselves. The scar, the coat, the silence, the restraint that looked like discipline but felt like penance. He had known men like this, leaders who carried their mistakes quietly, refusing comfort because comfort felt unearned. Thomas straightened slowly, using Ethan's arm not as support but as leverage. He stood on his own again, shoulders squared, coat still clutched shut. "I'm all right," he said, louder now for the room to hear. Ethan stepped half a pace back, though he stayed close. He studied Thomas's face with new eyes. The lines weren't just age. They were years of bearing something that had never been spoken aloud. Across the room, Caleb Morris finally found his voice. "That's enough," he said, though it came out weak, unsure. His hands trembled as he gestured toward the boys. "You can't. This isn't," Brandon scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. He looked at Tyler, who had gone quiet, eyes darting between Ethan and Thomas. Tyler's phone remained in his pocket now. He hadn't reached for it again. "You're overreacting," Brandon said, though his tone had shifted. "He's fine." Ethan turned his head slightly, eyes cutting toward Brandon. He didn't raise his voice. "Sit down," he said. This time, there was no laughter afterward. Brandon hesitated, pride warring with instinct. He looked around the room at the still customers, at Mary gripping the counter with white knuckles, at Caleb hovering uselessly near the register, and at Thomas. The old man met his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of distant authority that Brandon couldn't name. It wasn't dominance. It was something heavier. Brandon sat. Tyler followed, slower shoulders hunched inward. Thomas exhaled softly, the sound controlled, but weary. He adjusted his coat again, fingers lingering briefly at his chest before dropping away. The gesture went unnoticed by most. Not by Ethan. Ethan felt the weight of the whisper still ringing in his ears. "One of mine." The phrase echoed with implication. Responsibility, command, consequence. He had carried bodies before. He had followed orders he didn't agree with. But giving the order that killed someone you were meant to protect, that was a different kind of burden. Ethan stayed where he was, close enough to intervene, far enough to respect space. He did not ask questions. He knew better. The coffee shop remained locked in stillness, as if everyone sensed that something irreversible had just been spoken, even if they didn't know what it was. Thomas Caldwell stood upright, wet coat clinging to him, eyes forward, and Ethan Rowe understood that whatever came next, there would be no turning back. Ethan did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sit down," he said, again slower this time, his tone carrying the weight of certainty rather than threat. "Both of you, phones off, now." Brandon and Tyler obeyed, not because they were forced, but because something in Ethan's presence made resistance feel pointless. Brandon slumped into his chair, first jaw, tight eyes fixed on the tabletop. Tyler followed, shoulders hunched, his phone sliding out of his hand and onto the table as if it had suddenly become heavier than he remembered. Ethan turned to Thomas. For the first time since stepping in, he straightened fully and spoke with deliberate formality. "Admiral Caldwell," he said. The word landed like a bell struck in a quiet room. Several people looked up sharply. Mary's breath caught. Caleb froze where he stood. Even Brandon lifted his head, confusion flashing across his face. Thomas closed his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them again, the years seemed to settle differently on his face. His shoulders eased a fraction, not from relief, but from acceptance. He nodded once, an old acknowledgement reserved for those who understood what it cost to speak plainly. "You don't have to do this," Ethan added quietly, lowering his voice so only Thomas could hear. "Not for anyone here." Thomas studied him. Up close, Ethan could see the fine web of lines around the old man's eyes, the faint tremor that lived just beneath stillness. This was not weakness. It was restraint maintained for decades. "Yes," Thomas said, "I do." He turned slightly toward the room, not to the boys, not to the onlookers, but to the space itself, as if addressing something larger than the coffee shop. 36 years ago, Thomas began, his voice steady. I was commanding a joint naval task group in the North Atlantic. The words were measured, precise. Not a story told for drama, but a report delivered from memory. We were running a classified operation, multiple vessels, tight communication windows. Weather was deteriorating faster than forecast. Ethan listened, unmoving. Thomas continued. A radar signature appeared. Incomplete data, conflicting confirmations. I had seconds to decide. His hand drifted unconsciously toward his chest, resting there lightly, now not to hide, but to remember. I gave the order to engage. Silence pressed closer. The vessel was not hostile, Thomas said. It was allied. A misalignment in identification codes. A failure that began long before my command and ended with my decision. Mary felt her knees weaken. She leaned against the counter, one hand covering her mouth. The officer coordinating communications aboard that ship, Thomas went on, was my younger brother. A breath moved through the room like a ripple. Brandon stared, his earlier defiance draining from his face. Tyler swallowed hard, eyes wide, hands clenched in his lap. He didn't die immediately, Thomas said. His voice did not crack. When we realized the error, I boarded the damaged vessel with a rescue team. There was fire, twisted steel, debris everywhere. Ethan's jaw tightened. I found him, Thomas said, pinned beneath collapsed plating, still alive. The words were calm, too calm. I tried to move the wreckage. That's where the scar came from. He touched his chest once briefly. A secondary collapse. Shrapnel. It didn't matter. Thomas paused. He died before evacuation. No one spoke. Outside, a gust of wind swept leaves across the sidewalk, their soft scraping faintly audible through the glass. I was cleared, Thomas said. Officially. The investigation concluded procedural error across multiple levels. No court-martial, no public record. His eyes hardened slightly. But command doesn't end when paperwork does. Ethan felt something settle in his chest. He understood now not just the scar, but the coat, the silence, the refusal to explain. Thomas had not been hiding from judgment. He had been living with it. I retired 2 years later, Thomas said. I never removed myself from responsibility. I simply removed myself from visibility. He looked toward Brandon and Tyler then, not accusing, not angry. You poured water on me, he said evenly. That will dry. Brandon flinched, but some things Thomas added do not. Brandon's head dropped. Tyler followed, eyes fixed on the floor. I'm sorry, Brandon said at last. The words were quiet, stripped of bravado. I didn't know. No, Thomas replied. You didn't. Ethan stepped forward slightly, reclaiming the room's attention. Understanding doesn't come from knowing everything he said. It comes from knowing enough to stop. Tyler nodded quickly. Brandon wiped his face with the back of his hand. I'm sorry, Tyler said too. Really? Thomas regarded them for a long moment. Then he nodded once. That will do. The tension in the room began to loosen like a rope slowly uncoiling. Ethan turned back to Thomas. Sir, he said quietly, respect clear in his tone. You don't carry this alone anymore. Thomas looked at him, truly, looked at him, and for the first time, something in his expression softened. Neither do you, Thomas replied. Outside, autumn leaves continued to fall. Inside, the weight that had followed Thomas Caldwell for decades finally found a place to rest. Sometimes the miracle isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes the miracle is a moment of restraint, a truth finally spoken, or a heart that chooses understanding over cruelty. God doesn't always stop pain from happening, but He places people in the right place at the right time, so pain doesn't have the final word. In everyday life, at a coffee shop, on a quiet street, or in a moment we think doesn't matter, grace can still find us. If this story moved you, let it remind you to slow down, to look twice, and to treat every stranger as someone carrying a burden you cannot see. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what did this story mean to you? And if you believe that kindness still matters, subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories like this together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in your daily life. May peace find your home, and may grace meet you exactly where you are.